Ethan Collins strolled through the bustling airport terminal, blending seamlessly into the crowd. He was a man in his mid-40s with a quiet presence, dressed in a simple button-up shirt and worn leather jacket. To the world, he was just another traveler on a Monday morning, one of countless people shuffling from gate to gate. But the airline staff knew differently if they ever looked closely enough to recognize him. That is, Ethan owned Collins Air, one of the most respected airlines in the country. Yet few people knew his face. He preferred it that way. Anonymity had always suited him. It allowed him to move through his world without the weight of titles or expectations. Today, he was just another passenger, slipping into the first-class section of Flight 707 to New York. His purpose? Observing his airline from the inside, seeing it as his customers did, without anyone knowing who he really was. Settling into his seat near the window, Ethan watched passengers file down the aisle, the sounds of bags rustling and muffled greetings filling the cabin. His gaze lingered on a young woman a few rows ahead. She looked nervous, her hands clenching her bag as she darted anxious glances around her. She was clearly uncomfortable, either new to flying or carrying the burdens of an early morning departure. Ethan smiled faintly, a hint of sympathy flickering across his face. He remembered that feeling well, nerves twisting in his stomach, his hands gripping the armrests a little too tightly. It had been years since he'd felt that way, but the memory was fresh. A shadow crossed his aisle, interrupting his thoughts. He looked up to see a tall, stern-looking flight attendant with cold blue eyes and perfectly coiffed blonde hair. Her name tag read Maggie Rogers. She had an air of practiced elegance, but there was something unyielding in her expression, a sharpness that hinted at a habit of passing silent judgment. "Here's the menu," she said, handing it to him without so much as a glance. Her voice was flat, lacking the warmth that normally marked a flight attendant's greeting. Before Ethan could thank her, Maggie had already turned away, a wide, welcoming smile reserved for the businessman across the aisle. The man sported a gleaming designer watch and crisp suit, and Maggie's demeanor transformed instantly, her tone full of charm and politeness as she greeted him. Ethan watched, saying nothing. He was here to observe, after all, and Maggie was already providing a vivid illustration of a behavior he'd been hearing about in customer feedback. Her gaze swept over certain passengers with a look of mild disdain, as though they were somehow less deserving of her attention. Those who wore simple clothes or carried well-used bags earned only a cursory nod, while others, decked in luxury brands, received her smiles and accommodating gestures. As the plane filled and reached cruising altitude, Maggie began making her way down the aisle, tray in hand. When she reached Ethan's row, he politely asked for a cup of coffee. She barely glanced at him, her tone curt and dismissive. "Just coffee?" she echoed, as if his simple request were somehow offensive. "Yes, just coffee," he replied, maintaining his composure, though he could feel a twinge of irritation. With a roll of her eyes, Maggie turned, and as she poured the coffee, her grip shifted, causing the hot liquid to slosh over the rim, spilling onto his hand and shirt. Ethan flinched, feeling the sting as the heat seeped into his skin. "Oh, I'm so sorry," Maggie said, though her tone lacked genuine remorse. There was a slight smirk on her face, quickly concealed as she looked away, not bothering to offer a napkin or assist him further. "Clumsy me," she muttered, her expression hardening as she moved on, leaving Ethan to wipe himself off with his sleeve. Across the aisle, an older woman observed the entire scene, her brows knitting together in disapproval. She leaned over, whispering, "That was very uncalled for. I've never seen a flight attendant act so unprofessional." Ethan nodded, offering a quiet smile to the woman. "Thank you. I appreciate that." He accepted a tissue from her, dabbing his hand where the coffee had burned. He returned his gaze to Maggie, watching her move up and down the aisle, her demeanor shifting with each passenger based on her unspoken judgments. She acted as though he was invisible, as though his very presence was an irritation she could barely tolerate. But what Maggie didn't know, and what she would soon discover, was that she hadn't simply dismissed an ordinary passenger. The man she treated with disdain and spilled coffee on was not just any traveler, but the very owner of the airline she represented. As the plane soared through the skies, Ethan sat quietly in his seat, the faint sting of the spilled coffee still fresh on his hand. He had experienced enough in his career to remain calm under pressure. Yet Maggie's dismissive behavior was hard to ignore. For now, though, he chose to sit back, observe, and let the situation unfold, curious to see if she would show any trace of professionalism. But deep down, a quiet resolve was beginning to take root. Maggie continued her rounds, but with each step, her attitude only became more apparent. She moved up and down the aisle, giving warm smiles and attentive service to passengers she deemed worthy, those dressed in designer suits, carrying elegant leather bags, or wearing watches that glinted under the cabin lights. Yet each time she approached Ethan, she barely acknowledged his presence, her gaze sliding over him like he was nothing more than a piece of luggage. The difference in treatment was stark, almost painfully so. Ethan watched her, silently noting every small act of indifference. When a woman with a modest scarf and worn handbag asked for water, Maggie barely stopped long enough to hand her the drink, her impatience evident. But when the wealthy businessman a few seats over requested his coffee with an added dash of cream, Maggie practically glowed, bending over to chat as if he were an old friend. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he kept his expression neutral. A part of him wanted to call her out then and there, to let her know exactly who he was and the standards he expected on his airline. Yet, he remained quiet, knowing that sometimes actions spoke louder than words. Maggie was showing her true colors, and he wanted to see just how far she'd go. As the hours passed, other passengers began to take notice as well. Quiet murmurs spread throughout the cabin, and Ethan overheard snippets of conversation. "Did you see how she treated that man? Unbelievable. She didn't even offer him an apology." People were noticing her coldness, her dismissiveness, and her open favoritism. Ethan caught sympathetic glances from a few fellow passengers, their silent support giving him an unexpected sense of solidarity. Eventually, Maggie came back around to his row, carrying a tray of drinks. Ethan decided to test her reaction, requesting another cup of coffee, half expecting her to refuse outright. She didn't, but her eyes narrowed slightly, her lips curving into a tight, strained smile. "Just coffee?" she asked, her tone laced with impatience. "Yes," Ethan replied, matching her gaze with an unwavering calm. He could see a flicker of something in her eyes. Annoyance, perhaps, or maybe even a hint of fear, but she quickly masked it, pouring his coffee with an exaggerated motion that sent a few drops spilling over the edge of the cup. She handed it to him without a word and moved on, her cold shoulder unmistakable. Ethan took a slow breath, his patience wearing thin. The other passengers exchanged glances, their disapproval now openly visible. He could tell that Maggie was used to getting away with this behavior, secure in the belief that no one would call her out. But she was wrong, and in a few short hours, she would learn just how wrong she was. The plane continued on its path, and Maggie maintained her frosty demeanor toward anyone she deemed unfit for first class. Ethan kept his silence, but inside, a plan was already forming. He had worked too hard building Collins Air into a brand known for respect, courtesy, and world-class service to let one person tarnish that reputation. If Maggie thought she could treat people with disdain simply because of her personal biases, she would soon discover that he wasn't just any ordinary passenger. As the plane began its descent, Maggie finally made an announcement, her voice smooth and professional over the speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing shortly. Please make sure your seatbelts are fastened and your trays are up. Thank you for flying with us." Ethan straightened in his seat, mentally preparing for what was to come. He hadn't intended for today to be anything more than an observation, But Maggie's behavior had changed that. By the time the plane touched down, he had already made up his mind. He would address this, not just for himself but for every passenger who deserved better. As the plane taxied to the gate, Ethan waited patiently, allowing other passengers to gather their belongings and clear the aisle. He could feel Maggie's gaze on him as he finally stood up. Her eyes filled with the same dismissive disinterest she had shown throughout the flight. She positioned herself by the exit, offering cheerful farewells to select passengers, those who had passed her unspoken test. When Ethan reached her, she barely spared him a glance. "Goodbye," she said flatly, her eyes already shifting to the next passenger. Ethan offered her a warm smile, but there was a sharpness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "Goodbye, Maggie," he replied, his tone calm yet filled with a promise. "You may be hearing from me sooner than you think." Maggie's expression flickered, confusion briefly crossing her face, but she shrugged it off, dismissing him as just another inconsequential passenger. As Ethan stepped off the plane, he felt a quiet resolve settle over him. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. He was ready to address what he had witnessed, and Maggie would soon discover the consequences of underestimating the man she had so carelessly mistreated. Ethan Collins walked briskly through the terminal, a quiet determination in his step. He wasted no time dialing his assistant, Rachel, a woman as sharp as she was loyal. She'd been by his side for years, handling everything from boardroom negotiations to small, unexpected crises. Today, she would handle something more personal. "Rachel," he said, his voice steady, "I need you to set up a meeting with HR and the flight supervisor at our New York office, and make it urgent." Rachel didn't miss a beat. "Absolutely, Mr. Collins. Should I prepare any specific materials?" "Yes, I need a full report on the service records of one of our flight attendants, Maggie Rogers, and bring any recent passenger feedback that mentions her by name," he said, his tone firm. "It's time we had a serious conversation about our customer experience." He heard the pause on the other end, just long enough for her to register his words. "Understood. I'll arrange everything for tomorrow morning," she replied, her professionalism cutting through any hint of surprise. With the meeting set, Ethan spent the rest of the day gathering his thoughts. He knew the airline industry inside and out, and he knew how easily a single person's actions could erode a customer's trust. Collins Air had been built on a foundation of respect and quality service, a vision he'd poured his heart into from the very beginning. Maggie's treatment of him, and likely others, was a crack in that foundation, and he wasn't willing to let it spread. The next morning, Ethan arrived at Collins Air's New York headquarters. Rachel met him at the door, a thick folder in hand. "These are Maggie's records," she said, her voice low but serious. "You might not like what you see." Ethan opened the file, his eyes scanning page after page of customer complaints. Each one painted a similar picture. Passengers describing Maggie's dismissive attitude, her tendency to cater only to the right kind of people, and her indifference toward anyone who didn't fit her narrow criteria. There were notes from past supervisors as well, small warnings that had been given, but nothing severe enough to curb her behavior. By 10 a.m., the HR manager, Thomas Gray, and the head of customer service, Linda Shaw, joined him in the conference room. They exchanged polite greetings, but both could sense the gravity of the situation. They'd worked with Ethan long enough to know he rarely involved himself in personnel issues unless they were significant. "Thank you both for coming," Ethan began, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable weight. "I'm here today because I experienced something yesterday that I can't ignore. This isn't just about me. It's about the values we've promised to uphold." He recounted the events of the previous day, describing Maggie's dismissive attitude, her visible disdain for passengers she deemed unworthy of first class, and, finally, the coffee incident. As he spoke, he could see both Thomas and Linda's faces grow tense, their expressions shifting from surprise to concern. "It's not just one incident," Thomas said, flipping through Maggie's file. It seems there's a history here. Linda nodded, her tone sharp. Our brand is built on inclusivity and respect. We can't afford this kind of behavior from any of our staff, let alone a front-facing employee. Ethan looked between them, his expression resolute. I'd like to address this personally. Maggie needs to understand the seriousness of her actions, not just for the passengers she mistreated, but for the reputation of this airline. Thomas and Linda exchanged glances, both of them nodding. Understood, Mr. Collins. We'll bring her in shortly, Thomas replied. Minutes later, Maggie entered the room, her demeanor cautious. She looked around at the unfamiliar faces, a hint of nerves flashing in her eyes before she spotted Ethan at the table. Her face paled, the realization hitting her like a tidal wave. She knew him now, not as the unassuming passenger she'd dismissed, but as the owner of the airline itself. Mr. Collins, she stammered, attempting a smile, though it came off shaky and uncertain. I didn't realize. Ethan met her gaze, his expression calm but unyielding. Please, take a seat. Maggie. Maggie hesitated but eventually sat down, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. She glanced between Thomas and Linda, then back to Ethan, clearly trying to gauge the situation. Maggie, Ethan began, his voice measured. I didn't come here to receive special treatment yesterday. I came here because I believe in the standards Collins Air represents. What I witnessed, however, was far from those standards. Her face flushed, a mix of embarrassment and fear creeping into her eyes. Mr. Collins, I didn't know who you were. I never would have. Ethan raised a hand, silencing her. That's precisely the problem. It shouldn't matter who I am, or who any passenger is. Every person who boards one of our flights deserves respect and decency. Maggie opened her mouth to speak but closed it again, her shoulders sinking as Ethan's words settled over her. Linda, who had been silently observing, leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. Maggie, we've reviewed your service record, and this isn't the first time we've received complaints about your behavior. Passengers have noticed, and it reflects poorly on all of us. Maggie looked down, her hands trembling slightly. She didn't have a defense, and the gravity of her actions was beginning to sink in. Ethan leaned forward, his gaze steady. I've built this airline on principles of integrity and respect. Those values aren't negotiable. While I believe in second chances, Maggie, your record shows that you've been given many. A heavy silence filled the room as Maggie absorbed his words, the reality of the situation hitting her with undeniable force. She looked up at Ethan, her voice barely a whisper. I'm sorry, truly. Ethan gave a slight nod, but there was no anger in his expression, only a sense of finality. I hope this serves as a lesson. Maggie, respect costs nothing, but it means everything. Linda handed Maggie a small stack of papers, her tone sympathetic but professional. We'll provide you with a severance package, and we hope you take this time to reflect. Maggie took the papers with shaking hands. Nodding slowly, she looked at Ethan one last time, her gaze filled with a mixture of regret and resignation. Thank you for the opportunity, she said, her voice thick with emotion. With that, Maggie rose from her seat and walked out, her once confident stride now subdued. As the door closed behind her, Ethan felt the weight lift from his shoulders. He looked to Thomas and Linda, both of whom nodded in agreement. Thank you both, he said, his voice soft but firm. This was necessary for her, for our passengers, and for the integrity of Collins Air. As Ethan left the conference room, he felt a quiet satisfaction settle over him. He had stood up not only for himself but for every passenger who had ever been mistreated, for every traveler who deserved better. And in doing so, he knew he had reinforced the very values that Collins Air was built upon. Leaving the conference room, Ethan walked through the corridors of Collins Air's headquarters with a renewed sense of purpose. It wasn't easy to confront one of his own employees about something so deeply ingrained as respect. But he knew it had to be done. Today, he hadn't just set a precedent for Maggie. He'd drawn a line in the sand for every employee in his airline. And that line was a commitment to respect every passenger, no matter who they were or how they looked. As he reached his office, Rachel was waiting by the door with a faint, encouraging smile. "Everything went well?" she asked, handing him a fresh cup of coffee. Ethan took the cup, a small smile of gratitude on his lips. "Yes, it did. And thank you, Rachel, for gathering all the information so quickly. It made all the difference." Rachel nodded, her expression one of understanding and pride. She knew how much Collins Air meant to him, how every detail and every passenger experience mattered. "It's what we stand for," she replied softly. He settled into his office chair, letting the morning sun filter through the windows. The weight of the past day's events still lingered, but there was a sense of resolution now. He'd protected the values of Collins Air, values that had been his guiding force since the airline's founding. But he knew his work wasn't over. He picked up his phone and dialed Linda, the head of customer service. "Linda," he greeted when she answered. "I'd like to set up a company-wide meeting. Let's gather all flight staff and crew for a virtual conference this Friday. I want to talk to everyone about what happened on yesterday's flight. It's time we reinforce our standards." "Of course, Mr. Collins," Linda replied, her tone respectful and appreciative. "I think it's a great idea." As the days passed, word of Maggie's dismissal spread quietly through the company. It became a subtle but powerful message among employees. While most didn't know the exact details, they understood that the airline's founder was holding everyone accountable, including himself. It wasn't about punishing individuals. It was about safeguarding the values that Collins Air embodied. When Friday arrived, Ethan stood before a camera in a quiet studio, ready to address his team. Screens across Collins Air's offices and terminals lit up as employees tuned in. He could see faces of flight attendants, pilots, maintenance crews, and administrative staff, all eyes focused on him. The familiar feeling of leading his team filled him with a sense of responsibility, and he took a deep breath before he began. "Thank you all for being here," he started, his voice calm yet resolute. "I want to talk about something that happened on a recent flight, a reminder of why we're here and what we stand for." He recounted the experience on Flight 707 in a way that was respectful but unflinching. He described the disappointment he felt watching one of his own employees treat passengers as if they were less deserving based on appearances alone. He didn't need to mention Maggie by name. Everyone understood the weight of his words. "Respect and kindness cost us nothing," he continued, his gaze steady as he looked into the camera. "But they mean everything to our passengers. Every single person who boards one of our flights deserves to be treated with dignity and courtesy. That's what we promise. And it's a promise we can't afford to break." The silence on the other end of the line was profound, the gravity of his words sinking in. Ethan looked at the faces staring back at him, some somber, some nodding in agreement. He could feel the unity of purpose beginning to form, a shared commitment to uphold Collins Air's values. "As we move forward," he said, his tone softening, "I want each of you to remember why you're here, whether you're serving drinks, guiding passengers to their seats, or ensuring our planes are safe and ready to fly. You're part of something bigger. You're part of the experience we give to our passengers. And that experience should be nothing less than exceptional." After a moment's pause, he added, "And if any of you see something that doesn't align with our values, I urge you to speak up. Protecting our culture is a team effort, and every voice matters." He ended the call with a sense of satisfaction, knowing that his words had reached every corner of his airline. The weeks that followed proved transformative for Collins Air. Passengers began to notice small changes, the extra kindness of the flight staff, the attentiveness of attendants, the warmth of the customer service teams. Employees who once might have been hesitant to speak up about issues now felt empowered, knowing they had a leader who stood by the values he preached. Months later, Ethan boarded another Collins Air flight, once again incognito. As he settled into his seat, he glanced around, taking in the warmth and professionalism of the crew, who treated every passenger as though they were valued. He smiled to himself, feeling the pride of seeing his airline embody the very principles he'd always believed in. The plane took off, and as he gazed out the window, Ethan felt a deep, quiet fulfillment. Collins Air wasn't just his business, it was a reflection of his values, a testament to the idea that respect and kindness could elevate the simplest interactions. And as the city below faded from view, he knew he'd set a legacy worth every challenge, a standard that would carry on long after he was gone.